The sun was a merciless god in this part of the West, a white-hot eye in a bleached blue sky. It baked the ochre dust until it rose in ghostly plumes with every whisper of wind, clinging to the stunted sagebrush and coating the cracked earth in a fine, gritty powder. This was a land that offered no comfort, only the hard truths of survival etched in stone and thorn. And through this unforgiving landscape, a bride was running for her life. Her name was Clara, though the name felt like a borrowed thing, a label for a person she no longer was. The wedding dress, once a symbol of a future she never wanted, was now a tattered banner of her desperate flight. The delicate lace at the hem was shredded, stained with dirt and flecks of her own blood. The fine silk caught on every thorny bush, tearing with a sound that was unnervingly loud in the vast silence. She was barefoot, her soles a raw testament to the miles she had covered since clawing her way to freedom. Every step on the scorching ground was an agony of thorns and sharp stones. But it was a pain she welcomed. It was real. It was hers. It was not a pain inflicted by another's hand. She ran from the memory of carriage wheels churning up that same red dust, carrying her toward a life that was nothing more than a gilded cage. The dust had settled on the carriage windows then, too, obscuring the world she was leaving behind, a world that had already abandoned her long ago. Clara was an orphan, a ward of a stern, Eastern church that saw its duty as finding placements for its charges, be it in service or in marriage. For her, they had found what they called a providential match. The words had been spoken by the grim-faced matron, whose hands were always cold. Mr. Jedediah Thorne is a man of considerable means. Clara, he has built a veritable kingdom for himself in the territories. You will want for nothing. Want for nothing? The phrase had echoed in her mind as she first laid eyes on Mr. Thorne. He was older, a man whose wealth was etched in the deep lines around his mouth and the possessive gleam in his eyes, which were like chips of cold flint. He looked at her not as a prospective wife, but as a fine mare he was considering for his stables. He appraised her posture, her hands, the line of her jaw. His own hands were heavy, thick-fingered, and when he had taken hers in a perfunctory greeting, she had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had purchased her future, paid the church a handsome donation for their troubles, and in the eyes of God and man, she was his. The resistance had started subtly. Averted eyes, a quiet refusal to take his arm, a simple, whispered no when he tried to pull her into a shadowed corner of the surveyor's office where the papers were signed. That single word, small as it was, had ignited a fury in him that was terrifying in its coldness. He had not shouted. He had simply smiled, a tight, bloodless stretching of his lips, and waited. The true nature of her gilded cage was revealed that evening, when she again refused his advances, this time in the sprawling, desolate ranch house that was to be her home. His patience vanished. He did not strike her face. He was a man who cared for the appearance of his property, but his grip on her arm was like an iron vice, bruising her from wrist to elbow. He dragged her from the house, the fine fabric of her traveling dress scraping against the rough-hewn porch. The destination was not her new bedroom, but the stables. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, manure, and warm horseflesh. It was dark, the only light a sliver of moon through a high, grimy window. An unbroken filly needs a firm hand, he'd snarled, his voice a low rasp. You will learn your place, girl. You will learn to obey. He shoved her onto a pile of straw, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She heard the heavy bolt slide across the stable door, a sound of absolute finality. She was no longer a bride-to-be. She was a prisoner. She spent the night in the suffocating darkness, listening to the soft shifting of the horses, their quiet presence the only comfort in a world that had suddenly shrunk to the size of a stall. The humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain, the knowledge that she was seen as no different from the beasts around her. Her escape had not been a plan, but an act of pure, primal instinct. 2 nights later, the night before the circuit preacher was to arrive and sanctify the union, one of Thorne's ranch hands, drunk on cheap whiskey, had failed to properly secure the bolt. Clara, lying awake in the dark, her body a map of bruises, heard the scrape of wood on wood as the door drifted slightly ajar in the wind. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her despair. She moved with a silence born of terror. Her hands, raw and trembling, pushed the heavy door open just enough to slip through. The splintered wood tore at her palms, leaving trails of blood, but she didn't feel it. The cool night air on her face was a shock, a baptism into a new and dangerous freedom. She had one thought, one singular, burning purpose: to run. She ran past the main house, a dark monolith against the indifferent stars. She ran toward the jagged teeth of the foothills, praying the rocky, treacherous terrain would hide her tracks. She wore the wedding dress Thorne had forced her to put on that day for his own cruel amusement, a constant, ghostly reminder of what she was fleeing. Behind her, she knew what would be happening. Jedediah Thorne was not a man to suffer a slight, let alone the theft of what he considered his most valuable acquisition. In the cold light of dawn, he would not have felt sorrow or loss, only a black, possessive rage. He would not send a search party. He would hire hunters, men who tracked quarry for a price, who cared little whether that quarry was man or beast. "Find my property," she could almost hear him saying, his voice laced with venom. "Bring her back. Damaged is acceptable." Now, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. Clara's body was failing. Thirst was a living thing in her throat, a clawing demon. Her vision swam, the distant mesas blurring into a hazy purple smudge. Each breath was a ragged tear in her lungs. She stumbled, her bare foot catching on a root, and fell hard into the dust. She tried to push herself up, her bloody hands scrabbling for purchase, but her limbs would not obey. The world tilted, darkened at the edges, and as she collapsed at the foot of a lonely cluster of pines, the cool promise of their shade was the last thing she knew. He found her like that, a stain of white lace against the dark earth at the edge of the forest. Eli was not a man given to surprise, but the sight of a woman in a ruined wedding dress, unconscious in the middle of nowhere, was enough to make him rein in his steady buckskin mare. He was tracking a stray calf from his small herd, a simple task for the end of the day. But fate had other plans. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and quiet, the jingle of his spurs a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her still form. He saw the bruises on her arms, the raw, bleeding soles of her feet, the tear tracks clean through the mask of dust on her cheeks. This was not a runaway bride having second thoughts. This was a creature that had been hunted. And then he recognized her. It had been a few weeks ago, at the dusty way station 2 days' ride south. She had been with an older woman, stepping down from an eastbound stagecoach. Even then, surrounded by the grime and noise, she had a stillness about her, a fragility that seemed out of place in the harsh landscape. Their eyes had met for only a second. He, feeling clumsy and rough in his trail-worn clothes, had been struck by the deep, haunted blue of her gaze, mustering a courage he rarely felt around women. He had tipped his hat and taken a step toward her. "Ma'am," he'd begun, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Pardon me for asking, but I was wondering if you might tell me your name." Before she could answer, the stern-faced woman had taken her arm and pulled her away, shooting him a look of pure venom. The girl had glanced back over her shoulder, a flicker of something, regret, fear, in her eyes, before she was bustled inside. Eli had stood there for a long moment, the dust settling around him, the unspoken name hanging in the air. Now, he gently brushed a strand of matted hair from her face. He had his answer. Trouble had found her, and in turn, had found him. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the setting sun, he carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a feather, a broken bird. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He turned the mare not toward the nearest town, but toward the small, isolated ranch nestled in the high canyons that he called home. Clara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and pine, and a terrifying disorientation. The last thing she remembered was the unyielding earth. Now, she was on a soft mattress, a rough wool blanket covering her. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. She had been caught. He had found her. She scrambled backward on the cot, her eyes wide with terror, not yet focusing on the man who sat on a simple wooden chair across the small room. "Easy now," a low voice said. It was not Thorne's voice. It was calmer, deeper. "Easy, you're safe here." Her vision cleared. She saw a man, his face cast in the warm glow of an oil lamp. He was lean, with kind eyes and a face weathered by sun and wind. He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace. But she had been taught that no man's hands were peaceful. She flinched, pressing herself against the rough log wall, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. He saw the raw fear in her eyes and his heart ached. He didn't stand. He didn't move closer. He simply held her gaze and spoke again, his voice gentle. We met at the way station a few weeks back. You were with another lady." He saw a flicker of recognition, a crack in the wall of her panic. He pressed on, softly. "You were getting on the stage. I was clumsy. I'm sorry if I startled you then." He paused, letting the memory settle in the space between them. Clara's heart was still hammering against her ribs, but the rhythm was slowing. This was not one of Thorne's men. They were brutes, loud and cruel. This man was quiet. Still, he was a man, and she was trapped. Eli knew he had to bridge the final chasm of her fear. He gave her a small, sad smile. "I asked for your name," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You never got the chance to tell me." Clara woke to a silence so profound it felt like a sound in itself. It was a stark contrast to the cacophony of fear that had been her constant companion, the frantic pounding of her own heart, the whisper of the wind that sounded like pursuing footsteps, the grating memory of a heavy iron bolt sliding shut. Here, there was only the gentle sigh of the wind through pine trees and the slow, steady crackle of a fire in a nearby hearth. The air didn't smell of dust and terror, but of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and the clean, sharp scent of pine. She was in the same small room, on the same narrow cot, but the panic of the previous evening had receded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary caution. She sat up slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. The rough wool blanket was warm against her skin. She saw her tattered wedding dress folded neatly on a wooden stool, a ghostly relic of a life she had escaped. In its place, she was wearing a simple, oversized cotton shirt that smelled faintly of soap and the outdoors. It was a man's shirt, his shirt. The thought sent a tremor through her, a reflexive urge to hide, to make herself small. But there were no ropes on her wrists, no locked doors, no heavy presence standing guard. There was only the quiet. The door creaked open, and she flinched, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Eli stood in the doorway, not entering fully, as if he understood the room was her territory now. He held a steaming bowl in one hand and a tin cup in the other. He didn't smile, but his eyes, the color of a summer sky just before dusk, were steady and calm. "Figured you might be hungry," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't jar the stillness of the room. He set the bowl and cup down on the stool beside her dress. It was a simple gruel of oats and water, but the steam rising from it carried a promise of warmth and sustenance she craved more than she had realized. He retreated to the chair across the room, giving her space. He busied himself with mending a piece of leather tack, his hands deft and sure. He did not watch her, yet she felt his quiet, protective presence fill the small cabin. Hesitantly, she reached for the bowl. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. She ate slowly, the simple food an anchor in the swirling sea of her confusion. When she had finished, he looked up. His work paused. "I don't mean to press you, ma'am," he said, his gaze direct but not demanding. "But the name you told me last night, was it yours?" He was asking permission, not demanding an answer. He was giving her a choice, a luxury she hadn't been afforded in so long she'd forgotten what it felt like. She looked at this quiet stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had touched her only to save her and had spoken to her only with respect. The name was a key to a past she wanted to bury, a past that could put him in danger. But denying it, denying her own self, felt like a victory for Jedediah Thorne. Her throat was dry, the muscles stiff from disuse. She swallowed, and the sound was loud in the quiet room. A single word escaped her lips, so soft it was barely more than a breath. "Clara." He nodded once, a gesture of quiet acceptance. "Clara," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It's a good name." He went back to his work, and the silence that settled between them was no longer one of tension, but of fragile, unspoken truce. For the next 2 days, Clara existed in a state of watchful stillness. She did not speak of the man with flint-chip eyes, or the stable, or the desperate, bloody flight through the mountains. Her past was a locked box inside her, and she had no intention of opening it. She was a ghost in his home, moving silently from the cot to the chair by the window. Her body healed with excruciating slowness. Eli cleaned and dressed the wounds on her feet with a gentle competence that belied his calloused hands, never once remarking on their severity. He brought her food, kept the fire lit, and left her to the silence of her thoughts. He learned to read the topography of her fear. One afternoon, the sound of a horse approaching the cabin at a canter, a ranch hand from a neighboring spread, it turned out, made her freeze, the cup of water trembling in her hands. Her eyes darted to the door, wide and wild, her entire body coiled as if to bolt. Eli, who had been oiling a rifle by the fire, simply moved to stand in the open doorway. His frame blocking the view from the outside, he spoke to the other man in a low, calm voice, his presence a solid wall between her and the perceived threat. When the rider was gone, Eli turned back. He did not ask her what had frightened her. He just resumed his task, his quiet presence a reassurance more powerful than any words could have been. On the third evening, she felt strong enough to stand on the porch. The sun was setting, bleeding fiery color across the horizon and bathing the high valley in a soft, golden light. A small band of horses, his horses, galloped across the wide pasture below the cabin, their manes and tails streaming behind them. They ran not from fear, but for the sheer joy of it, their powerful bodies moving with a grace and freedom that made Clara's chest ache. She gripped the rough-hewn porch railing, her knuckles white, for the first time since the cold-handed matron had told her of her providential match. A feeling other than terror or despair settled in her heart. It was a strange, hollowed-out sensation, and it took her a long moment to recognize it. Peace. Eli came to stand beside her, not too close, leaning against a support post. They watched the horses run until they were just dark specks in the twilight. "My mother loved to watch them run," he said quietly, his voice weaving into the evening air. "She said they were the only creatures God made that were never really broken." Clara remained silent, but it was a silence that invited more. "She wasn't from around here," he continued, his gaze fixed on the darkening plains. "She came west with a man, a lawman. He promised her the world, a house, a family, his name." Eli's voice was flat, devoid of pity. "He gave her a child, me, but he never gave her his name. He died in a shootout before he got around to it." He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, She saw the ghost of an old hurt in his eyes. To the good folks in town, she wasn't a grieving widow. She was just the marshal's woman, the mother of his bastard son. They were pious people. They knew the words for what she was, and none of them were kind. He looked away again, toward the mountains that cradled his secluded ranch. We learned to make our own way, just the two of us. Learned that what people call you and what you are can be two very different things. Clara felt a profound and sudden connection to this man, a kinship that transcended their different histories. He was an outcast, just as she was. He was a survivor of a quiet kind of cruelty, a judgment passed down by a world that valued names and papers over the contents of a person's heart. They were both scarred by the injustice of others, branded by circumstances they did not choose. In the fading light, they stood together, two solitary figures bound by an unspoken understanding. That night, the peace she had found was shattered. Sleep offered no escape, only a dark, twisted path back to the terror. She was in the stable again, the air thick with the smell of manure and fear. Jedediah's face loomed over her, his lips curled in that cold, bloodless smile. His heavy hands reached for her, not with the quick violence of a strap, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was infinitely more terrifying. The silk of the wedding dress tore in his grip, the sound ripping through her mind as a silent scream. She awoke with a strangled cry, thrashing against the blankets, her heart a wild animal trapped in her ribs. The dream clung to her like a shroud, so real she could still feel the phantom touch, the suffocating darkness. The cabin door flew open. Eli stood there, a silhouette against the moonlit doorway, a rifle in his hand. He took in the scene in an instant, her tangled in the sheets, her face pale with horror, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He set the rifle down and was at her side in 2 long strides. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent but soft. "You're here. You're safe. It was just a dream." But she couldn't stop shaking, her body still trapped in the nightmare's grip. She was drowning in the memory of that suffocating powerlessness. Without thinking, he knelt beside the cot and reached out, taking her trembling hand in his. His touch was a shock. It was nothing like the heavy, possessive grip from her nightmares. His hand was warm and firm, calloused from work but gentle in its intent. It was not a touch that sought to take or to control, but one that offered an anchor in the storm. For a paralyzing moment, her every instinct screamed at her to pull away, to recoil from the touch of any man. Fear and a deep, ingrained revulsion warred within her. But then something else surfaced, through the terror. A strange and unfamiliar sensation seeped into her awareness. It was the solid warmth of his palm against hers, a feeling of steadiness, of safety. His touch was not an invasion. It was a tether to the quiet, real room, pulling her away from the suffocating darkness of the past. And beneath it all, a tiny, terrifying flicker of something else sparked to life. A warmth that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the man kneeling beside her in the dark. It was a feeling so foreign and so frightening that it stole the breath from her lungs, leaving her trembling for an entirely new reason. The night of the dream marked a subtle but profound shift, after Eli's steadying presence had chased the last of the shadows from her mind. Clara understood that she could not remain a fragile ghost in his home. To heal was not just to let her wounds scab over. It was to reclaim the strength in her own limbs, to feel the solid earth beneath her feet and know that she stood upon it by her own volition. She would not be a burden. She would work. The next morning, she was up before him, coaxing the embers in the hearth back to life. When he entered the main room, he found her attempting to haul 2 heavy wooden buckets of water from the well. He stopped, a protest on his lips, but it died when he saw the fierce determination etched on her face. It was not the desperate flight of a hunted animal, but the quiet resolve of a survivor. Without a word, he took 1 bucket from her, and they walked back to the cabin together, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Thus began their life together. Clara learned the daily rituals of the small, isolated ranch. She fed the chickens, their clucking a cheerful sound in the morning stillness. She learned to mend tack, the smell of leather and oil becoming familiar and comforting. She even helped him patch a section of the cabin's roof, her initial fear of the height giving way to a surprising sense of accomplishment as she hammered the wooden shingles into place under his patient guidance. The physical labor was a balm, an anchor. It left her too tired for nightmares and filled her days with purpose, pushing the dark memories into the deeper recesses of her mind. They fell into a routine of shared silences and small moments of connection. Dinners were quiet affairs, the clink of forks against tin plates the primary conversation. But gradually, words began to fill the space between them. She would ask about the brand on his horses, and he would explain its history. He would ask if she had ever seen mountains so high, and she would tell him of the rolling, gentle hills of the east, a world away from this rugged, majestic landscape. One afternoon, he saddled the calmest of his mares for her. "She's gentle," he'd said. "Name's Promise." Clara, who had only ever been in a carriage, was hesitant. But Eli's hands were steady as he showed her how to hold the reins, his instructions clear and calm. He rode beside her, never crowding her, as they moved out of the pasture and into the vast, sun-scorched plains. For the first time, she felt the immense, liberating scale of the West. They rode until the sun was a fiery globe on the horizon, the sky a canvas of impossible color. Beside her, Eli was a part of the landscape, his silhouette as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. In that moment, watching him against the dying light, a feeling of profound gratitude, so intense it was almost painful, swelled in her chest. Their fragile peace was shattered by a storm that rolled in from the north, swift and violent. They had been miles from the cabin, checking a fence line in a far pasture when the sky turned a bruised purple-gray. The wind rose with a sudden, mournful howl, and the first drops of rain, cold and heavy, began to fall. "The stable!" Eli shouted over the rising gale. "It's closer!" He urged his horse forward, and Clara followed. The rain coming down in blinding sheets, soaking them to the bone in seconds. They reached the small, sturdy stable just as the heavens opened completely, the rain drumming a deafening tattoo on the roof. They stumbled inside, leading the horses into the stalls, the air thick with the smell of wet animals, damp earth, and hay. Lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the building. Clara cried out and flinched, the sound and the sudden darkness of the stable, so reminiscent of her prison, plunging her back into a state of primal fear. "It's all right," Eli's voice came from nearby, a low, steady anchor in the roaring chaos. A moment later, a match scraped, and the warm, flickering light of a lantern pushed back the shadows. He was not Jedediah Thorne. He was just Eli, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt soaked through, his eyes filled with concern for her. But the setting was a cruel echo. She unconsciously wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, though not entirely from the cold. The storm showed no signs of abating. They were trapped. Eli busied himself by rubbing down the horses with dry sacks. Clara watched him, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a tense awareness. The lantern light cast dancing shadows on the walls, enclosing them in a small, intimate world. The thin, wet fabric of her dress clung to her skin, and she knew her shift did the same to him, outlining the strong, lean muscles of his back and shoulders. She had never been so acutely aware of another person's physical presence. He finished with the horses and turned to her. "You're freezing," he said, his brow furrowed. He moved toward a cleaner pile of hay in a corner where several thick horse blankets were folded. He picked one up. It was coarse and smelled of wool and horse, but it was dry. He came toward her, and she stood frozen. He stopped in front of her, the blanket held out. "Here." Her hands wouldn't move to take it. Seeing her hesitation, he stepped closer. shaking the blanket open. "Let me," he said softly. He gently draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the damp skin of her neck and shoulder, a touch that was meant to be purely practical, comforting. But for Clara, it was fire, a shiver, violent and uncontrollable, racked her body. Eli misinterpreted it as a reaction to the cold. His hands lingered on her shoulders, his grip firming slightly as if to steady her, to impart his own warmth. "Clara?" he whispered. She looked up at him. In the flickering lamplight, his face was all sharp angles and soft shadows. His eyes were no longer just kind. They held a new intensity, a question she was terrified to answer. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade into a distant hum. All she could hear was the frantic beat of her own heart. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. His gaze dropped to her lips. It was happening, the thing she had both feared and, in a secret, shameful part of her heart, yearned for. Her breath hitched. Her mind screamed asterisk, no asterisk, a chorus of remembered pain and humiliation. But her body, treacherous and alive, swayed toward him. For a single, suspended heartbeat, she was lost. Then, just as his lips were about to touch hers, the image of another face flashed behind her eyes, Jedediah Thorne's cruel smile, his possessive eyes, the phantom sensation of his heavy, unwanted hands. Panic, cold and absolute, ripped through her. With a choked gasp, she turned her head sharply, breaking the spell. His lips brushed her cheek. I can't," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. She pulled away from him, clutching the blanket around her like a shield, and stumbled toward the far side of the stable, her back to him. The morning after was a torment of brittle silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken words and heavy regret. Clara moved like a phantom, her face a pale, closed mask. She avoided his eyes, her answers to his quiet questions clipped and empty. Eli watched her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He felt like a brute, a clumsy fool who had mistaken her reliance for affection. He had seen the flicker of response in her eyes in the stable, but he had also seen the sheer terror that had extinguished it. He had pushed her, frightened her, and shattered the fragile trust they had so carefully built. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had promised himself he would be her sanctuary, and instead, he had become another source of fear, unable to bear the suffocating tension. Clara fled the cabin, gathering a bundle of laundry as an excuse. She made her way down to the creek that ran through the property, its water clear and cold. She knelt on a flat stone at the water's edge and began to scrub the clothes with a harsh, punishing rhythm, as if she could wash away the memory of the night before, of her own confusing, treacherous response. She paused, her hands submerged in the icy water, and looked down. In the rippling surface, her own reflection stared back at her, a wavering, distorted image. The sight of her own fractured face in the water triggered something deep and dark. The creek disappeared, replaced by the grimy water of a horse trough. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was the night Thorne had locked her in the stables, the night he had found her weeping over the beautiful wedding dress he intended to force upon her. He had ripped it from her, his voice a venomous whisper as he told her what she was. His property, a thing to be used and discarded as he saw fit. He had shown her what a firm hand meant, the sting of his anger, a brutal lesson. The reflection in the water was no longer hers, but that of a terrified girl, her face streaked with tears and blood. Seeing her spirit being broken, a sob escaped her lips, raw and ragged. She finally understood the terror that had seized her in the stable with Eli. It wasn't him she was afraid of, it was the ghost of Thorne, a ghost that lived in any man's touch, in any man's wanting gaze. The desire she had felt for Eli was inextricably tangled with the revulsion she felt for the other man, creating a knot of emotion so tight she couldn't breathe. That afternoon, seeking a refuge from her own thoughts, she found a small, leather-bound notebook on a shelf near Eli's cot. It was his ledger, filled with neat columns of figures and notes about supplies. Tucked in the back were several blank pages. She took it, along with a small nub of charcoal she found near the hearth, and retreated to her room. She did not know what to write at first, but then the words began to flow, a torrent of feelings she could never speak aloud. She wrote of the fear, the shame, and the confusing warmth she felt when Eli was near. When words failed her, her hand began to move on its own. She drew the horses running free in the pasture. She drew the jagged line of the mountains against the sky. Then, hesitantly, she began to sketch a face from memory. It was Eli's, his profile as he looked out at the sunset, his expression calm and steady. She drew in silence, her secret confession taking shape not in words, but in the soft, charcoal lines on the page. It was the only way she could allow herself to hold on to his image without the fear that it would break. The weeks that followed the storm settled into a rhythm of quiet domesticity, a fragile peace built in the heart of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The chill between Clara and Eli thawed, replaced by a careful, unspoken understanding. The memory of that night in the stable remained, a charged current beneath the surface of their daily lives. But they navigated around it, finding solace in the shared work and the comfortable silence of their evenings. Clara began to feel the tight knot of fear in her stomach loosen, thread by thread. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond the next sunrise. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. He was a wiry man with a sun-bleached mustache and weary eyes, riding a sweat-lathered horse that had clearly been pushed hard. Clara was outside, scattering feed for the chickens. When she saw him approach, a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline shot through her. Every stranger was a potential threat, every approaching hoofbeat a harbinger of doom. She instinctively backed away toward the cabin, her hand flying to her throat. Eli emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the rider, then glanced at Clara, taking in her frozen posture and wide, terrified eyes. A hard, protective look settled on his face. He walked to meet the man, positioning himself so that his body was between the stranger and the cabin. "Caleb," Eli said, his voice low and devoid of welcome. "Been a long time. What brings you this far up?" The man, Caleb, dismounted wearily. "Business, Eli. The kind that pays well, but leaves a bad taste in your mouth." He spoke in a hushed tone, but the wind carried fragments of their conversation to where Clara stood. Rooted to the spot, she heard the words, "reward," "significant sum," and then a name that made the blood freeze in her veins. "A runaway bride?" Caleb was saying. "Goes by Clara." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She could not hear Eli's reply, but she saw his shoulders tense, his whole body go rigid. Caleb spoke for a few more minutes, then passed Eli a folded, grimy piece of paper. The two men shook hands, a brief, perfunctory gesture, and Caleb mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which he had emerged. Eli did not move for a long time. He stood staring at the paper in his hand, his back to her. When he finally turned, his face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He walked past her into the cabin without a word, the easy companionship of the past weeks gone, evaporated in the dry desert air. A new, more terrible silence descended upon the cabin. Eli was not unkind, but he was distant. The space he had so carefully given her now felt like a chasm. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, a flicker of something in his eyes she couldn't name. Doubt, pity, suspicion. She felt his gaze on her like a physical weight. The questions he wasn't asking screamed in the quiet between them. Asterisk. "Who are you?" "Clara, what trouble have you brought to my door?" Her sanctuary had become a cage of a different kind, one built of suspicion and unspoken truths. The fear she had begun to master came roaring back, more potent than ever, because now it was laced with the terrifying prospect of losing the only kindness she had ever known. A few days later, Eli rode to a small settlement a half-day away for supplies. It was the first time he had left her alone since her arrival. "Bolt the door behind me," he'd said, his voice flat. "Don't open it for anyone." The words were for her protection, but they sounded like a jailer's command. While he was gone, a frantic energy seized her. She cleaned the cabin with a feverish intensity, scrubbing floors that were already clean, trying to physically wipe away the tension that choked the air. While tidying his few belongings, she found it. Tucked beneath a stack of old almanacs was a recent newspaper, folded to a specific page. It was not the paper Caleb had given him. This was something newer, something Eli must have picked up in town. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with a dreadful certainty, what she would find. Her hands trembling, she unfolded the newspaper. It was the Territorial Enterprise *, and there, on the third page, was a column detailing local news. Her eyes scanned the dense print until they landed on a headline that made her breath catch in her throat. "Tragedy strikes Thorn Ranch. Bride-to-be, a violent lunatic, flees after attempted murder." The article was a masterpiece of cruel fiction, penned by a man who knew how to wield words like a whip. It painted a picture of Jedediah Thorn as a benevolent, heartbroken philanthropist who had taken in a troubled young orphan, hoping to give her a respectable life. It spoke of Clara's violent outbursts and fits of madness. And then came the core of the lie, the venomous ink that was meant to be her death sentence. Asterisk. It is believed the young woman, in a fit of greed and insanity, attempted to poison Mr. Thorne's evening meal before fleeing in the dead of night with a strongbox containing a significant quantity of gold dust and several heirlooms. A ranch hand who attempted to stop her was grievously injured, struck down by a heavy iron skillet wielded by the surprisingly strong madwoman. Mr. Thorne, in his grief, has offered a substantial reward for her capture, hoping she can be brought to justice and committed to an asylum where she can no longer harm herself or others. A low, strangled sound escaped her. A thief, a murderer, a lunatic. He had erased her completely, replacing her with a monster. This wasn't just about reclaiming his property anymore. This was a hunt. He had turned the entire territory against her. Anyone who found her would not see a desperate girl fleeing for her life. They would see a cash reward, a dangerous criminal to be brought down, and they would see the man harboring her, Eli, as an accomplice. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was a plague. She had brought this darkness to the one place she had found light. By staying, she was not only risking her own life, but his as well. Her instinct, honed by a lifetime of survival, screamed at her, *run*. That night, she waited until the cabin was steeped in the deep silence of sleep. Eli lay on his cot across the room, his breathing slow and steady. The moon cast a pale, ghostly light through the window, with movements as silent as a moth's wing. She slipped out of bed. She did not take much, a small loaf of bread, a canteen of water. She paused, her eyes falling on the simple cotton shirt he had given her to wear. With a pang of grief so sharp it almost made her cry out. She folded it and put it back. She would take nothing of his with her, not even a memory. She was a ghost, and she had to disappear. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the simple wooden latch. This was it. She would melt back into the wilderness, take her chances with the coyotes and the sun. It was a better fate than bringing Jedediah Thorne's wrath down on Eli's head. "Don't!" The voice came from the darkness behind her, low and thick with sleep, but firm as bedrock. She froze, her hand recoiling from the door as if it were red hot. Eli was sitting up on his cot, a dark silhouette against the moonlit window. He wasn't angry. In his voice, she heard a profound and weary sadness. Running won't solve anything. Clara. She turned slowly. A trapped animal. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice cracking. He'll find me. He'll find you. I have to go. I understand that you're scared, he said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He stood up and took a slow step toward her. And I understand that you've been lying to me. The accusation, though spoken softly, was a slap. Tears pricked her eyes. I didn't want to bring this on you. This isn't about me, he said, his voice still quiet, but now edged with an intensity that pinned her in place. He stopped a few feet from her. I've been piecing it together. The fear in your eyes, the story Caleb told me, the things I read in that paper. His gaze was unwavering. He says you're a thief, a killer, a madwoman. He took another step, closing the distance between them. The air crackled with a tension that was almost unbearable. He's asking for Clara, Eli said, his voice dropping to a raw, emotional whisper. So I need you to tell me the truth. Just this one thing. He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw not suspicion, but a desperate plea for honesty. What is your name, really? The question broke her. It was not an accusation, but an invitation, an offer to see past the lies, past the monster in the newspaper, to the real person underneath. A dam of unshed tears, of unspoken agony, burst inside her. A great, shuddering sob tore through her body, and she collapsed in on herself, her hands covering her face. The whole ugly story came pouring out, a torrent of broken words and weeping. She told him about the church, about being sold like livestock. She spoke of Jedediah's cold eyes and heavy hands, of the humiliation of being locked in the stable. She confessed her terror, her despair, how she had knelt in the filthy straw and prayed to a silent God to just let her die. The words were a chaotic, painful flood, washing away all the secrets, leaving her utterly exposed and vulnerable before him. When she was finished, an exhausted silence filled the room. She kept her face hidden, unable to bear the look of disgust or pity she was sure she would find in his eyes. She waited for him to tell her to leave, to cast her out into the night she so desperately sought. She heard him move, but it was not toward the door. He stepped behind her. She flinched as she felt his hands on her shoulders, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He did not try to turn her around. He simply stood there, his hands a warm, steady weight, a silent shield at her back. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't identify. I don't care what your name is, he said softly, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. I don't care what he calls you. He paused, his grip on her shoulders tightening just enough to let her know he was not letting go. You're still the one whose name I beg to know. The simple, profound truth of his words bypassed all her defenses, striking a place in her heart she thought had long since turned to stone. He wasn't saving a runaway. He was protecting the woman he had seen at the way station, the one whose haunted blue eyes had captured him in a single glance. In that moment, he gave her back a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. He gently pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned into his embrace, her weeping softening into quiet, cleansing tears. The hard, sharp edges of her pain began to dissolve in the circle of his arms. It was not a lover's embrace, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was the embrace of a safe harbor, a promise that she was no longer alone in the storm. The confession, spoken into the heart of the moonlit cabin, was a breaking and a remaking. In laying her past bare, Clara had expected to be cast out, a carrier of a plague too dangerous to harbor. Instead, Eli's embrace had offered not just sanctuary, but acceptance. It was a foundation upon which something new could be built. The decision to stay was no longer a matter of survival. It was a choice, the first real one she had made in a lifetime. She would not hide in his shadow. She would stand beside him and build. Their days took on a new purpose, a shared project of creation and repair. They turned their attention to an old, dilapidated stable at the far end of the property, its bones stooped and weathered by years of neglect. The work was hard, the labor a language they both understood. They tore out rotted planks, the splintered wood a tangible representation of the past she was leaving behind. They raised new beams, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. He would lift, and she would brace. She would hold a nail, and he would drive it home with two clean, powerful strokes of the hammer. In the sweat and sawdust, a partnership was forged, stronger than any words. They tilled a small patch of earth near the cabin, the soil dark and rich. Clara pushed seeds into the furrows with her fingertips, a quiet prayer for new life in each one. She was planting roots in this wild, unforgiving land, this small pocket of peace that Eli had carved out of it. Together, they wrestled with the stubborn, squealing mechanics of an old water pump, their hands and faces smeared with grease until, with a final, groaning shudder, it coughed to life, gushing clear, cold water. Clara laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that startled them both. Eli looked at her, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its braid, and a slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his sky-blue eyes. The sun was a constant, searing presence, and the work was relentless. One blistering afternoon, as they were setting a new gatepost, the heat became oppressive. Eli stopped, pulling the damp, sweat-soaked cotton of his shirt away from his skin. With a sigh of relief, he stripped it off, tossing it over a fence rail. Clara froze, her hands still on the heavy wooden post. She had seen him as a protector, a savior, a kind and gentle man. But now, for the first time, she saw the man himself. The sun gilded the skin of his back and shoulders, highlighting the lean, hard cords of muscle that shifted with his every movement. He was not a brute like Thorn, whose flesh was soft with indolence and cruelty. Eli's strength was earned, carved from the land itself, from years of hard labor under this very sun. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed deep within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature. It was a slow, unfolding recognition of a desire that was entirely her own, not a response to a man's pursuit, but a feeling that originated purely within her. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She looked at him, and she wanted... A few days later, Eli decided it was time. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice serious. He laid his Colt revolver on the rough-hewn table between them. "Not because I expect trouble, but because a person ought to know how to defend their own life. It gives you a say in things." He was giving her back a measure of power, the very thing that had been stolen from her. They walked to a clearing behind the cabin, where he had set up some old tins on a log. The gun felt unnaturally heavy and cold in her hands, an object of immense and terrible potential. "All right," he said, coming to stand behind her. "You hold it steady now, both hands." She was trembling, the barrel of the gun wavering. He moved closer, his body a solid, warm presence at her back. He reached around her, his larger, calloused hands covering her own, steadying her grip. His chest was pressed against her shoulder blades, and she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. His chin was just above her shoulder, and his breath was a warm whisper against her ear as he spoke. "Line up the sight at the end of the barrel with the one back here," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her. "Breathe out slow, and don't jerk the trigger, just a gentle squeeze." The world narrowed to the small metal sight, the distant tin can, and the solid, encompassing presence of the man behind her. The smell of gun oil, of pine, of him, filled her senses. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil jolting her back against his chest. She had missed the can entirely, but it didn't matter. In that moment, a different kind of charge had passed between them, more potent than gunpowder. He didn't let go immediately. His hands remained over hers, his body a shield and a support. The shared shock of the gunshot held them suspended in time, a breath away from something more. When he finally stepped back, the space between them felt charged, electric. That evening, a cool breeze finally offered a reprieve from the day's heat. They sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. Eli had brought out a jug of hard apple cider he'd traded for in town. He poured them each a tin cup, and the sweet, sharp tang of it was a welcome balm to their tired bodies. They talked little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the new awareness that hummed between them. When the jug was half empty and the moon was high, they moved inside to the small, warm kitchen. Clara began to clear their dinner plates, her movements slow and deliberate. Eli stood by the hearth, watching her, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. She placed the last plate on the drying rack and turned. He was still watching her, his gaze intense, questioning. The memory of the stable, of her pulling away, hung in the air. But something was different now. The fear that had once been her master was now just a quiet, fading echo. In its place was the memory of his hands on hers, his voice in her ear, and the undeniable longing she had felt watching him in the afternoon sun. She dried her hands on a cloth, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. She crossed the small space between them. He did not move, did not breathe. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. And then, with a courage that came from a place deep within her she didn't know she possessed, she slowly raised her hand. She didn't touch his lips or his jaw. She gently laid her palm against the rough, warm skin of his cheek. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. It was her choice, her move, her permission. A shudder went through his powerful frame. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch as if it were the most precious thing he had ever known. When he opened them again, they were dark with an emotion so raw and deep it stole her breath. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not hesitant or tentative. It was a collision of two lonely souls who had found their counterpart in the wilderness. It was the heat of the sun, the coolness of the cider, the shared sweat of their labor, the unspoken longing of weeks. It was a kiss of pure, unadorned want, free from the shadows of the past, free from obligation or fear. It was a homecoming. His hands came up to cradle her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as if she were made of the most fragile glass. He drew her closer, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing herself against the solid strength of his chest, finally surrendering to the desire she had for so long denied. Gently, he swept her into his arms and carried her to his cot. He laid her down not with the urgency of a man taking, but with the reverence of a man receiving a sacred gift. Every touch that followed was a question, his eyes searching hers for permission, for reassurance, and every touch she returned was a resounding asterisk, yes, asterisk. He undressed her slowly, his gaze worshipful, as if he were unwrapping a miracle. This was not the tearing of silk by a cruel hand, but the gentle peeling away of layers of pain and fear, revealing the woman who had been buried underneath. Later, in the quiet darkness, they lay tangled together, the cool night air a soft caress on their bare skin. For the first time in her life, Clara felt utterly, completely whole. She was not a piece of property, not a victim, not a runaway. She was just a woman, lying in the arms of a man who saw her, truly saw her. She turned to him, tracing the line of his jaw in the moonlight. He caught her hand and brought her fingers to his lips. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her temple. "Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here," he answered, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "You're the first," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "You're the first person to touch me who didn't make me feel dirty." He gathered her closer, his embrace fierce and protective. He held her like that for a long time, simply letting her feel safe, cherished, and clean. The shadows of Jedediah Thorne had finally, truly been banished by the light. The next morning, she awoke to the golden light of dawn filtering through the window, and the unfamiliar, wonderful weight of his arm across her waist. She lay still, memorizing the feeling of his steady breathing against her back, the scent of him, the absolute peace of the moment. He stirred, his hold on her tightening. "Morning," he murmured into her hair. She turned in his arms to face him. "Morning," she replied, a real genuine smile gracing her lips. He looked at her, his eyes serious now, tracing the features of her face as if memorizing them. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the still morning air. It wasn't a question born of passion, but a statement of fact, a declaration. "I don't care what Thorne says you are," he continued, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "I don't care if the whole territory thinks you're a madwoman. I don't care if we have to live up here for the rest of our lives, scorned by every soul in this land. I know who you are, and I want you to be my wife." The morning after Eli's proposal was a thing of impossible beauty. For the first time, Clara awoke not with a jolt of fear, but with a slow, languid stretch, the warmth of Eli's body a solid and reassuring presence beside her. They did not speak of the future, of Jedediah Thorne, or the bounty that hung over her head. Instead, they spoke of the present, of the fence that needed mending and the coming winter. They existed in a bubble of fragile, perfect peace, a world that consisted only of the cabin, the mountains, and the endless sky. The word yes to his proposal was not spoken. It was lived in every glance, every shared task, every moment she chose to stay. Their perfect, sun-drenched bubble was burst by the sound of approaching horses. It was late afternoon. Eli was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat for their small world. Clara was on the porch, mending one of his shirts. The simple, domestic act a quiet declaration of belonging. There were two riders, not one, and they were not meandering. They rode with a purpose that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand on end. They were not cowboys or drifters. They wore the tarnished silver badges of county law. Eli's axe stopped mid-swing. He set it down slowly, deliberately, his entire body radiating a dangerous calm. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow and moved to stand at the bottom of the porch steps, a silent, unmovable guardian. The lead rider, a portly man with a florid face and a self-important air, reined in his horse. "You Eli Miller?" he asked, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man who rarely met resistance. "I am," Eli said, his voice flat and hard as stone. The man's eyes flickered past Eli to Clara, who had risen to her feet, the mending forgotten in her lap. A slow, unpleasant smirk spread across his face. "Well now, looks like our information was good." He unrolled a piece of paper, its official seal prominent. "I have a warrant, issued by Circuit Judge Abernathy, for the arrest of one Clara May Finley." He paused for dramatic effect. "Charges are grand theft and attempted murder, perpetrated against Mr. Jedediah Thorne." The world dissolved into a dull, roaring sound in Clara's ears. It was happening. The life she had just begun to believe in was being torn from her grasp. "There's been a mistake," Eli said, his voice lethally quiet. "The woman you're looking for isn't here." The deputy chuckled, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "Son, don't play dumb with me. Thorne described her to a T, and he's a very influential man. Mr. Thorne, a pillar of the community. His word carries a lot of weight." The man's hand drifted down, coming to rest on the butt of his pistol. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. It's all the same to me." Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Clara could see the muscles in his jaw working, the barely contained rage coiling within him. For a terrifying second, she thought he would lunge, that he would try to fight them. But he was one man against two, and they had the law on their side, bought and paid for though it might be. He was no fool. Violence would only get him killed and her captured anyway. His shoulders sagged in a barely perceptible gesture of defeat, and the fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a cold, simmering fury. Clara took a step forward. "Don't," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Please, Eli, don't." The second deputy, a younger, leaner man, dismounted and approached the porch, a length of rope in his hand. Clara did not shrink from him. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. She had been running for so long. The chase was finally over. She held out her hands, a silent, dignified surrender. The rough rope bit into her wrists, a familiar, humiliating sensation. As they led her to one of the horses, her eyes locked with Eli's. In their depths, she saw a promise, a vow of such fierce intensity it was like a physical blow. It said, "Asterisk, this is not the end. I will find you." They forced her onto the horse, and as they rode away, she kept her gaze fixed on him, a lone figure standing in a cloud of red dust, watching his world being taken from him, until the cabin and the man who was its heart disappeared from view. The jail was a stone box of despair. It was less a building than a hole in the ground. Attached to the back of the sheriff's office in the nearest town, they led her down a set of damp, crumbling steps into a subterranean gloom that smelled of mold, unwashed bodies, and hopelessness. The cell was a small, cage-like affair with a dirt floor, a single, reeking bucket in the corner, and a thin, lice-ridden blanket on a stone ledge. The only light came from a tiny, barred window set high in the wall, a sliver of mocking blue in the oppressive dark. The heavy iron door clanged shut, the sound echoing the finality of the bolt on Thorne's stable. The brief, beautiful interlude of her life with Eli was over. It had been a dream, a fantasy. This was reality. She was property, and she had been returned to her cage. The days bled into one another in a gray, featureless haze, twice a day. A guard would shove a tin plate of watery, flavorless stew and a piece of stale bread through a slot in the door. She ate only what she had to keep from fainting. The nights were worse, filled with the scratching of rats in the walls and the drunken shouts of men in the other cells. The darkness was absolute, a perfect canvas for her memories of Jedediah's cruelty and the fresh, agonizing pain of Eli's stolen face. One afternoon, she heard his voice. He was upstairs, in the sheriff's office, his tone low and urgent. She scrambled to the cell door, pressing her face against the cold iron bars, straining to hear. "I have a right to see her," Eli was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And I have a right to refuse," came the smug reply of the deputy who had arrested her. "She's a dangerous prisoner. No visitors. Judge's orders." "Judge's orders or Thorne's?" Eli shot back. "You'd be wise to watch your mouth. Miller, associating with a known murderess is bad for a man's reputation. Now get out of my office before I decide to arrest you for obstruction." She heard the scrape of a chair, the thud of heavy footsteps, and then the slam of the main door. He was gone. A sob of pure, undiluted despair escaped her, and she slid down the bars to the filthy floor, burying her face in her hands. He had tried. He was out there, but the world was Thorne's, and they were just trespassers in it. Eli rode away from the jail, a black, helpless rage churning in his gut. His fists were clenched so tight on the reins that his knuckles were white. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands, with strength and leverage. But this was a different kind of fight. Thorne's power was a poison that had seeped into the very foundations of the law. To fight it with fists would be like punching smoke. He needed a different weapon. He needed wisdom. He knew where to find it. He pointed his horse toward the small, white-steepled church at the edge of town, the church of Reverend Michael Thompson. The Reverend was a man of God, but not the sort to offer empty platitudes and prayers. He was a man of righteous fire, a scholar of both Scripture and the flawed laws of men. Years ago, when the town's good women had whispered about Eli's mother, shunning her in the street, Reverend Thompson had delivered a sermon on hypocrisy and compassion from the pulpit that had silenced the gossips for good. He had stood for them when no one else would. Eli was praying he would do so again. He found the Reverend in his study, a room lined with books, smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. He was a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and eyes that held both a scholar's insight and a deep, abiding kindness. He listened without interruption as Eli poured out the entire story, from the moment he found Clara in the wilderness to the smug dismissal of the deputy just an hour before. When Eli was finished, the Reverend steepled his long, thin fingers and stared into the middle distance. "Jedediah Thorne," he said, the name tasting like something foul. "He is a man of great wealth and little character. He sees the world, and everyone in it, as his personal property. He has purchased influence with the judge, the sheriff, with anyone whose loyalty is for sale." "Then it's hopeless," Eli said, the words tasting like ash. "No," the Reverend said, his sharp eyes meeting Eli's. "It is not hopeless, but it is difficult. On paper, Mr. Thorne is the aggrieved party. He has a marriage contract, a document the church in the East foolishly provided him, which the law will see as a bill of sale. He has a story of theft and violence. All we have is the word of a terrified young woman he has already branded as a lunatic." "Then what do we do?" Eli pleaded, leaning forward in his chair. "We do not fight him on his terms," the Reverend explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "We cannot prove she didn't take the gold, because it is her word against his. Instead, we must attack the very foundation of his claim. We must prove two things to a jury. First, that this was not a marriage contract, but an illegal act of human trafficking, a purchase. And second, far more importantly, we must prove that his actions toward her were not those of a concerned fiancé, but of a cruel and abusive captor. We must prove that she did not flee out of greed, but to save her own life." A sliver of hope ignited in Eli's chest. "How? It's still her word against his." "We need a witness," the Reverend said simply. "Someone else who saw his cruelty. Someone who can testify to the truth of her imprisonment. Did she ever mention anyone at the ranch? A servant? A cook? Anyone who might have shown her a moment of kindness?" Eli's mind raced. Clara's story, told in the dark of the cabin, had been a torrent of pain, but a few details had stood out. "A girl," he said, the memory solidifying. "A housemaid. Clara said the girl left a stable door unbolted one night. She said she thought the girl did it on purpose. She gave Clara a piece of bread before she ran." "Find her, Eli," the Reverend urged, his voice ringing with purpose. "Find that girl. She is the key. Convince her to speak the truth. It will be our only weapon against the lies of a rich and powerful man." The quest gave Eli's rage a focus. He rode from the church not as a helpless man, but as a hunter with a singular purpose. He spent 2 days asking careful questions in dusty saloons and general stores. Following a cold trail, he knew the girl would have fled Thorne's ranch, terrified of his wrath. Finally, in a town 50 miles west, he found her. Her name was Sarah, and she was working as a laundress in the back of a dingy hotel, her hands raw and red from the lye soap. She was terrified when she saw him. Her first instinct was to run. "Please," Eli said, blocking her path, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not with him. I'm here to help Clara." Tears welled in the young woman's eyes. "They took her?" she whispered. "They did. And they're going to send her to prison, or worse, unless someone tells the truth about what Thorne did to her." He looked at her, his gaze pleading. "She told me you helped her. She said you left the door open." Sarah began to tremble, wrapping her arms around herself. "He would kill me," she breathed, her eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Thorne, you don't know what he's like. He's a monster. I have a family." "And Clara has no one but us," Eli said, his voice raw with desperation. He took a step closer. "I am not asking you to be brave for me. I am asking you to be brave for the girl whose tears you saw. I am asking you to remember the sound of his hand striking her face, of her being dragged to that stable. If you stay silent, you are letting him win. You are letting him destroy her. Is that a silence you can live with?" He saw the war in her eyes, the stark, primal fear warring with the flicker of her conscience. He saw the memory of Clara's suffering, a burden she had carried in silence for weeks. Her tears began to fall, tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "God help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "God help us all. I'll do it." The courtroom was a crucible, a small, suffocating box built of rough-hewn timber and thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. Sunlight streamed through the tall, dusty windows, illuminating the swirling motes of dust and casting harsh lines across the room, dividing it into islands of shadow and light. To Clara, seated beside Reverend Thompson at a small defense table, it felt like a stage set for an execution. The townspeople had packed the benches, their faces a gallery of grim curiosity, their minds likely already made up by the whispers and the damning words printed in the newspaper. At the prosecutor's table sat Jedediah Thorne. He was the picture of aggrieved civility, dressed in a tailored black suit that spoke of Eastern money and power. He looked not at Clara, but at the jury, his expression one of profound, tragic sorrow. He was a master performer, and this was his grandest stage. When he was called to the stand, he moved with a somber grace. His testimony was a masterpiece of deception. He spoke of his noble intentions, of his desire to give a poor, unfortunate orphan a life of comfort and respectability. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the courtroom as he painted a picture of Clara as a troubled, fragile creature, prone to fits of delusion and rage. "I saw a darkness in her, it's true," he said, dabbing a pristine silk handkerchief at the corner of his eye. "A wildness. But I believed, in my foolish heart, that kindness and a stable home could cure her." He spoke of the alleged theft, his voice breaking with theatrical pain. "It was not the gold I mourned. It was the betrayal, the violence." He detailed the fabricated attack on the ranch hand, his words weaving a tapestry of lies so convincing that Clara almost began to doubt her own reality. He was a pillar of the community, a wealthy and pious man. She was a nameless, penniless waif. The jury watched him, their expressions a mixture of pity and admiration. They were eating from the palm of his hand. When it was Eli's turn to testify, the atmosphere in the room shifted. He was not polished or eloquent. He was a simple man of the earth, and he spoke with a plain, unvarnished honesty that was a stark contrast to Thorne's florid performance. Dressed in his clean but worn clothes, he took the stand and looked not at the jury, but directly at Clara, a silent offering of strength. He told them of the day he found her. He described the tattered wedding dress, the raw, bleeding soles of her feet, the map of bruises on her arms. "A woman doesn't get injuries like that from a simple fall," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "That is the look of a creature that has been hunted." The prosecutor, a slick, ambitious man named Davies, rose to cross-examine him. "Mr. Miller," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "are you a doctor?" "No, sir." "So your assessment of her injuries is merely the uneducated guess of a simple rancher?" "I know what I saw," Eli said, his gaze unwavering. "And what you saw was a pretty young woman in distress." Davies pressed on. "Is it not true that you were immediately smitten? Is it not possible that your affection for this woman has clouded your judgment, leading you to concoct this fanciful story of a hunted creature to protect her?" "I saw the fear in her eyes," Eli said, his voice dropping, drawing the courtroom into the quiet intensity of his memory. "It wasn't the fear of being caught, it was the fear of being returned. There's a difference. Anyone who's ever seen a trapped animal would know it." He was dismissed, his honest words hanging in the air. But they were just words, seeds of doubt thrown against Thorne's solid wall of lies and influence. The prosecutor rested his case, a smug, confident smile on his face. The judge, a stern man named Abernathy, whose impartiality was questionable, looked as if he was ready to instruct the jury. It was all but over. "The defense calls one final witness." Reverend Thompson's voice rang out, clear and steady in the tense silence. "We call Miss Sarah Gable to the stand." A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne, who had been looking supremely confident, stiffened. A flicker of something cold and venomous passed through his eyes before his mask of sorrowful composure slipped back into place. At the back of the courtroom, a door opened, and Sarah entered, escorted by the town's blacksmith, a man whose formidable size had been enlisted for her protection. She was a ghost, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost palpable. She looked like a frightened rabbit, and Clara's heart broke for the courage it must have taken for her to walk that long path to the witness stand. She would not look at Thorne, keeping her eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they were a lifeline. Reverend Thompson approached her, his manner as gentle as if he were tending to a wounded bird. "Miss Gable," he began, his voice soft, "could you please tell the court where you were employed before coming to this town?" I was a housemaid," she whispered, her voice so faint the judge had to lean forward to hear. "At the ranch of Mr. Jedediah Thorne." Thorne sat as still as a statue, his hands clasped on the table before him, but a muscle had begun to twitch in his jaw. "And while you were in his employ," the Reverend continued, "did you have occasion to interact with Miss Clara Finley?" "Yes, sir," Sarah breathed. She was to be his wife." "And how did Mr. Thorne treat his betrothed?" Sarah swallowed hard, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing of the witness box. "He was not kind, sir. He treated her like she was one of the horses, something he had bought and owned. He would grab her arm, hard enough to leave marks. His voice, when he was displeased, it was like a razor." "Objection!" Davies shouted, leaping to his feet. "The witness is offering unsubstantiated opinions and hearsay." "Overruled," Judge Abernathy grunted, his eyes now fixed on Sarah with a new, sharp interest. "Continue, Reverend." "Miss Gable," the Reverend said, his voice still gentle but firm. "Was there a specific incident of this unkindness that you witnessed? Something you cannot forget?" Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. She finally, bravely, lifted her head and looked at the jury. "It was the night before she ran," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from her conviction. "She had been weeping. Mr. Thorne, he did not like to see her cry. He said it was a sign of a weak and ungrateful character." She took a shaky breath, the memory vivid in her eyes. "He dragged her out of the house. He took her to the horse trough." The courtroom was utterly silent, hanging on her every word. "He told her he would give her something to cry about," Sarah continued, her voice trembling with the horror of the recollection. "And he pushed her head down into the water. He held her there. She was struggling, thrashing. I thought he was going to kill her. When he finally pulled her up, she was gasping, choking, and he looked at her, with her hair all wet and water streaming from her face, and he smiled. He told her she was to remember who she belonged to." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Thorne's mask had finally cracked. His face was a thunderous canvas of pure, unrestrained fury. He looked at Sarah with such murderous intent that several people on the front bench physically recoiled. When Sarah stepped down, the jury looked not at her, but at Jedediah Thorne, and for the first time they saw him not as a pillar of the community, but as the monster from a young woman's testimony. "The defense calls Clara Finley," the Reverend said. Clara walked to the stand, her legs unsteady but her resolve a solid core of steel inside her. She felt Eli's gaze on her, a silent river of support. She sat down and looked directly at Jedediah Thorne. For the first time, he could not meet her eyes. She told her story, not with the theatrics of Thorne or the raw terror of Sarah, but with a quiet, chilling dignity. She spoke of the cold-handed matron at the church, of the journey west in a dusty carriage toward a man she had never met. She spoke of the heavy weight of his hands, the possessive gleam in his eyes, the soul-crushing humiliation of being locked in a dark, filthy stable. "He did not want a wife," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the spellbound courtroom. "He wanted an object, a pretty thing to display, a creature to command. Every day, he took a piece of me, a piece of my spirit, until I was not a person anymore. I was just a shell, filled with fear." She paused, gathering all of her pain, all of her suffering, into one final, defiant statement. She looked past Thorne, past the judge, to the faces of the ordinary men and women on the jury. "The prosecutor claims I fled with gold, out of greed and madness," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "But I took nothing from that house but the clothes on my back and a heart full of terror. I ran into a desert with no water and no food, knowing I would likely perish." She finally allowed her voice to break, not with weakness, but with the raw power of her truth. "I would rather have died in that desert," she cried, her voice ringing with conviction, "than live another day as his chained dog." The words fell into a silence so profound it was like a physical blow. No one moved, no one breathed. The truth, raw and undeniable, had finally scoured away all the lies. Every person in that room knew, with absolute certainty, that they had just heard it. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat, his face grim. He did not even bother sending the jury to deliberate. He looked directly at them, then at Thorne, his expression one of cold fury. "In the matter of the Territory versus Clara Finley," he declared, his voice booming in the stillness, "this court finds the defendant, Miss Finley, entirely and unequivocally not guilty of all charges." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled. Clara's knees washed over her. Eli let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. But the judge was not finished. He leveled a hard, unforgiving stare at Jedediah Thorne. "Furthermore," he announced, his voice like cracking stone, "in light of the credible and deeply disturbing testimony presented here today, this court orders an immediate and thorough investigation into the affairs of Mr. Jedediah Thorne, specifically concerning the charges of human trafficking, assault, and perjury." Thorne's face contorted in a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. His carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust around him. As two deputies moved to flank him, he was no longer a pillar of the community. He was just a small, cruel man, finally caught in the glare of a light he could no longer control. The judge's final words echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom, a hammer blow that shattered Jedediah Thorne's world and, in the same instant, handed Clara her own, freedom. The word was a foreign concept, a taste she had never known. People surged around her, the blacksmith clapping a grateful Reverend Thompson on the back. Townswomen who had previously stared at her with suspicion now offering watery, sympathetic smiles. Eli was there, of course. He broke through the small crowd, his face a mask of such profound relief and love that it almost brought her to her knees. He reached for her, his hands hovering as if he were afraid she might shatter. She took them, his calloused palms a familiar, grounding anchor in the dizzying swirl of her new reality. He wanted to sweep her up, to take her back to the sanctuary of the cabin, to the life that was waiting for them. She could see it in his eyes. But as he started to lead her away, she gently pulled back. "Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm. "Not yet." He stopped, his brow furrowing with confusion and a flicker of hurt. "Clara, you're free. We can go home." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand something she barely understood herself. "The court has set me free," she explained, her gaze drifting toward the open doorway and the sliver of blue sky beyond. "But I am not yet, not inside." The jail cell was gone, but its shadow lingered. Thorn was defeated, but his ghost still lived in the dark corners of her mind. To go back to the cabin now would be to bring those ghosts with her, to taint the one clean, safe place she had ever known. I need a little time," she said. "Alone." Understanding, deep and absolute, dawned in his eyes. He saw that this was not a rejection, but the final, necessary act of her own salvation. He had found her. He had fought for her, but only she could truly heal herself. He nodded slowly, his grip on her hands tightening for a brief, reassuring moment before he let go. "I'll be waiting," he said, his voice a vow. "The cabin will be waiting." He watched as she walked away from the courthouse, not toward the stables, but toward the jagged, indifferent line of the mountains that rose up behind the town. She didn't look back. Clara walked for the rest of that day, her feet carrying her up into the high country. She was not running now. Her steps were deliberate, measured. This was a pilgrimage. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with pine and the clean, mineral smell of stone. She found a small, hidden spring bubbling up from a rock face and drank deeply, the icy water a purifying shock to her system. For 3 days, she lived in the wilderness. She was no stranger to hardship. But this was different. This was hardship she had chosen. She slept under a blanket of brilliant, uncaring stars, the silence of the mountains a soothing balm on her frayed spirit. During the day, she walked, letting the sun warm her face and the wind strip away the last remnants of the jail's chill and Thorn's foul memory. She sat for hours on a high ledge, looking out over the vast, sprawling territory below. She saw the dust devil that was the town, the green ribbon of the river, the distant smudge that was Thorn's ranch, and the tiny, almost invisible speck nestled in the canyons that was Eli's homestead. From up here, it all seemed so small. Her pain, her fear, the man who had caused it all. They were just tiny parts of a much larger, wilder world. In that vastness, she found perspective. She thought of the trial, of Sarah's trembling voice and Eli's unwavering gaze. She had been fought for. She had been believed. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. On the 3rd morning, as the sun crested the eastern peaks, bathing the world in a clean, new light, she knew she was ready. She was finally, truly free. Eli waited. The days of her absence were the longest of his life, a torment of quiet faith and gnawing anxiety. He trusted her, trusted the journey she had to take. But the silence of the cabin was a hollow ache in his chest. To keep his hands and his mind busy, he did the only thing he could think of. He baked bread. Clara had shown him how, her hands moving with a forgotten muscle memory from her time in the orphanage. He had watched, fascinated, as she kneaded the dough, her movement strong and sure. It was a creative, hopeful act, turning simple flour and water into something warm and life-sustaining. And so, every morning, he mixed the dough, his clumsy hands gradually learning the rhythm of the work. He would knead his hope, his fear, and his unwavering love into the loaf. He would bake it in the small hearth, and the warm, wholesome scent would fill the empty cabin, a prayer for her return. He would eat a single piece and leave the rest on the table, waiting for her. On the 4th morning, he was pulling another loaf from the hearth when a shadow fell across the open doorway. He looked up, his heart stopping in his chest. It was Clara. She stood on the threshold, silhouetted against the brilliant morning sun. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess. Her face was tanned by the sun, and her clothes were dusty and trail-worn. But her eyes were clear. The haunted, hunted look that had been there since the day he first saw her was gone. In its place was a profound and luminous calm. She looked tired, and she looked beautiful, and she looked, for the first time, completely whole. In her hands, she clutched the small, leather-bound notebook, his notebook. Neither of them spoke. Words were useless, inadequate things for a moment like this. He slowly wiped the flour from his hands onto his trousers and walked toward her. She took a step inside, meeting him in the center of the room. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray leaf from her tangled hair. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. Then, without a word, she held out the notebook to him. He took it. It fell open to a page filled not with figures or lists, but with a detailed, tenderly rendered charcoal sketch of his own face, his profile as he looked out at the sunset. He turned the page, and there was another, and another. Pages filled with him, with the horses, with the cabin, with every detail of the life they had begun to build. It was her secret heart, her silent confession, and she was giving it to him freely. He closed the book, his throat thick with an emotion too powerful for words. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that shared gaze, a lifetime of promises was made and accepted. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them, burying her face in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her not with the desperation of a man who had almost lost everything, but with the quiet, certain strength of a man who had just come home. They stood there for a long time, locked in a silent, perfect embrace, as the smell of fresh bread filled the air around them. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 1 year later, the setting sun painted the high desert in strokes of gold and fire. The little cabin no longer looked like a lonely outpost, but the heart of a thriving home. The vegetable garden was lush and overflowing, and the newly built stable stood strong and proud. A child, a little boy of no more than a year, with his mother's deep blue eyes and his father's unruly brown hair, toddled on unsteady legs across the packed earth of the yard. He was barefoot, his chubby feet kicking up little puffs of the same red dust that had once stained his mother's bleeding soles. He let out a squeal of pure, unadulterated joy as he chased after a chicken, his laughter a bright, clear sound in the evening stillness. From the porch, Clara and Eli watched him, their hands intertwined. Eli's arm was wrapped securely around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, her head resting on his chest, her body fitting perfectly against his. A quiet peace radiated from them, the kind of deep contentment that is earned, not given. Later that night, long after the child was asleep and the moon had risen high over the mountains, Clara sat at the small kitchen table, by the soft glow of an oil lamp. She opened a new journal, a gift from Eli. On the first page, she wrote, her handwriting clear and steady. "The day I fled, my only prayer was to survive. But he found me. He taught me that a life is not just a thing to be saved, but a thing to be lived. And now, I understand. I no longer live simply to survive. I live to love." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop a comment below and let's all connect. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier. And be sure to share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.